the rage beneath the hope. They called her hair the color of bad luck. They called her presence a curse. A man she had never met turned his back on her in front of the whole town because of the color of her hair and walked into a saloon without a second look. She had $7, a one-way ticket with nowhere to return to, and a trunk full of everything she owned sitting in the red dirt of a town that had already decided what she was. Most women would have gotten back on the stage. Rose Calloway was not most women. And Redstone Flats was about to find out exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman who has already survived the worst thing imaginable and learned that surviving is just the beginning. This channel is built for people who believe that the American West was not just a place, it was a promise. Stories of love that endures, of mothers who move mountains, of strangers who become family, of the human heart at its most stubborn and most beautiful. Remember this. They can close every door. They cannot close the one inside you. The fire you carry is yours. Nobody gave it to you. Nobody can take it away. If Rose's story moved you, share it with one person today who needs to be reminded of their own strength. Drop a comment, we read every single one. And subscribe, because we have many more stories like this one waiting for you.
I bought a one-way ticket to New Mexico territory with $7.80 left to my name, a battered valise that had belonged to my mother, and the particular kind of hope that only survives in people who have already lost everything once and figured out they can survive it. My name is Rosaline Calloway. Most people call me Rose, which suits me better anyway. Roses are tougher than they look, and so am I. I was 27 years old when I boarded that train in Cincinnati on a Tuesday morning in late August of 1878. I had sold my best sewing machine, paid off half a legal debt that was not my fault to begin with, and said goodbye to a city that had taken everything from me and given back very little in return. My husband Thomas had been dead for 18 months. He died in the Meridian coal shaft collapse, one of 11 men who went down in the morning and did not come up again, because a man named Aldous Fitch had received 3 separate safety reports about the shaft's instability and decided the cost of repairs was inconvenient. Fitch hired lawyers. Fitch paid the coroner. Fitch had dinner with the mayor the week after the funerals and was never charged with a single thing. I spent 14 months trying to change that. I hired an attorney on credit. I collected testimony from surviving miners who were afraid to give it, but gave it anyway. I wrote letters to the newspaper. I showed up at Fitch's office twice and was removed by his private security both times. I lost. Completely, publicly, expensively. The legal debt was $340. I earned $4.20 a week doing piecework alterations. I lived in 2 rooms above a tannery that smelled exactly like you would expect. When the advertisement appeared in the Cincinnati Enquirer, a widowed rancher in New Mexico territory seeks a capable, hard-working woman for partnership in life and honest labor, I did not respond immediately. I sat with it for 2 weeks, read it 6 times, wrote 3 drafts of a letter before I sent the 4th. Edmund Graff wrote back within 10 days. His letters were measured, careful, honest about his limitations. He was 71, he told me, not looking for romance. Looking for someone to help manage the ranch house, keep the books, have someone to talk to in the evenings. He offered a wage on top of room and board, regardless of whether we decided to marry. He said he believed a woman ought to have her own money. I thought, this is either the most decent man in the territory or the most convincing liar I have ever read. I decided it did not matter. I had nothing left to lose. 3 months of letters followed, 14 in total. I read them so many times I had passages memorized. Then I sold the sewing machine, bought the ticket, and packed everything I owned into my mother's old valise. My last evening in Cincinnati, I sat on the floor of my empty apartment eating cold beans from the tin and did not cry. I had cried over Thomas, over the lawsuit, over the sewing machine. I had a limited supply of tears, and I had stopped spending them on situations I could still change. The train departed at 6 in the morning. I was the first one on it. Somewhere in Missouri, a woman dropped into the seat beside me without asking and immediately began talking. Her name was Nora Finch. Irish-born, red-cheeked, divorced from a Philadelphia shipping clerk she had discovered keeping a second family in Baltimore. Nora was unbothered in a way I found either inspiring or alarming. I could not decide which. She was going to Redstone Flats, New Mexico territory, to take over her aunt's eating house. She had inherited it last spring and was going to make a go of it. "And you?" she asked. I gave her the short version. Thomas, the lawsuit. Aldous Fitch, 14 months of losing. Edmund Graff and his advertisement in the Inquirer. Nora listened without interrupting, which I would later recognize as one of her rarest qualities. "Mail order," she said when I finished. "Not a judgment. A categorization." "You know it might be terrible," she added. "I know. Or he might be lovely." "I know that too." "Well," she produced a flask and offered it. "Either way, you will not face it alone. I make very good biscuits, and I've been told I am excellent company in a crisis." I took the flask. The whiskey was terrible. I drank it anyway. 3 days of travel through Kansas and into New Mexico territory. The landscape changed outside the window in a way that felt almost personal. Flat plains giving way to red rock formations, the sky expanding until it seemed impossible. The vegetation shrinking and toughening until only the most stubborn things survived. I read Edmund's last letter again on the final day. Something nagged at me. A small thing I could not name. I folded it away and watched the desert pass. The train pulled into Redstone Flats at 4 in the afternoon when the sun was still brutal and the platform dust rose in little red clouds around every footstep. I stepped off and looked for Edmund Graff. He was not there. I looked again, studied every face on the platform, checked the letter for the correct date. The platform emptied. The train moved on. I stood alone with my valise in the New Mexico heat, the red cliffs burning orange above the town, and absolutely no idea what came next. Nora appeared beside me a moment later, her own bag over her shoulder, and looked at the empty platform with the expression of someone conducting a rapid assessment of a bad situation. "All right," she said. "Let us go find out what is happening." In the distance, Redstone Flats shimmered like a mirage in the heat. I picked up my valise, squared my shoulders, and walked toward it. I had learned in the past 2 years that the only difference between a woman who survives and a woman who does not is which direction she decides to walk when everything falls apart. I walked forward. It was the only direction I knew. I had prepared for many possibilities, that Edmund would be older than his letters suggested, that the ranch would be rougher than described, that the life I was walking into would require more of me than I had planned to give. I had not prepared for the particular silence that fell over the saloon when I asked for Edmund Graff by name. The kind of silence that means everyone in the room already knows something you do not. Nora read the room in approximately 3 seconds and put her hand on my arm before I could ask a second question. We got the answer instead from Sheriff Walt Tanner, a big, weathered man with the slow, careful movements of someone who has learned that patience prevents most gunfights. He found us on the boardwalk outside, having apparently been told by someone in the saloon that the red-haired woman was asking about Graff. Tanner told me the facts plainly. Edmund Graff had died 23 days ago. His horse threw him on the Eastern Trail. He was found the next morning. He was buried 3 days later in the churchyard. "A letter was sent to Cincinnati," Tanner said. His eyes were on the middle distance. "To inform you. I expect it crossed paths with you somewhere on the route." I looked at him. He was not lying exactly, but he was not comfortable either. "Who sent the letter?" I asked. A pause that lasted 1 beat too long. "Hargrove's office handled the estate notification," he said. "Standard practice." I filed this away and said nothing. The reality of my situation was not comfortable to look at directly, so I looked at it anyway. No money to go back. The return ticket alone would cost more than I had. Even if I could afford it, I would arrive in Cincinnati with nothing. No apartment, no sewing machine, no furniture. I had sold everything to come here. The ranch had been sealed by Hargrove's bank pending what Tanner called probate proceedings. I had no legal standing to enter it and no claim recognized by anyone in this town. I had a valise, $6.40, the clothes on my back, and Nora, who immediately offered me the storeroom behind her eating house at no charge until I figured something out. That evening, I sat on the front steps of Nora's building watching the main street settle into blue dusk. A rider came in from the north, a big dark horse, a man who sat a saddle like he was born in one. He stopped at the livery, dismounted, spoke briefly with the owner. Tall, black-haired. He moved with the economy of a man who had stopped wasting effort on things that did not matter. He glanced down the street. His eyes found me, or found the general direction of me, for less than 2 seconds. Then he went into the livery, and the doors closed. I did not know who he was. I noticed him anyway. That night, in Nora's storeroom that smelled of flour and dried beans, I took out Edmund's letters and read them again, all 14, in order. The last letter was dated 6 weeks ago. It confirmed my travel date and said he was looking forward to my arrival. The closing lines read, "I believe you are exactly the kind of woman this land needs, Miss Calloway, steady, clear-eyed, not easily frightened." A strange thing to write to someone you had never met. Almost like a message rather than a pleasantry. I examined the handwriting. The body of the letter matched the others, the careful, slightly shaky script of an old man. But the last paragraph was different. The pen pressure was more decisive. The letter forms were almost the same, but not quite. Someone else had written the final paragraph. I folded the letter, lay down on my bedroll, stared at the dark ceiling. I was either in the middle of something very dangerous or I was exhausted and imagining patterns in coincidence. I had learned in the past 2 years that patterns in coincidence are usually just patterns. I got up, lit the small lamp, took out a sheet of paper. At the top I wrote, "What I know, what I do not know, what I need to find out." I filled the page. Then I made a list of people to talk to, beginning with the town doctor who would have examined Edmund's body. I went back to sleep at midnight and slept better than I had in weeks. That probably said something about my character. I was not sure it was flattering. In the morning, I found Doc Silas Hennessy at his office before 7. He was a small, precise man who moved like every joint gave him trouble. He looked at me for a long moment when I explained who I was and why I was there. Then he closed the office door. He told me what he had seen when he examined Edmund's body. The injuries were consistent with a fall, but not entirely. There was bruising on the upper arms, the kind left by gripping hands, not impact. There was a contusion at the base of the skull that could have come from a rock or from something that struck Edmund before the fall. He had noted it all in his examination report. The report was gone. Tanner's office had requested it for the file. It was never returned. "I should have pushed harder," Doc Hennessy said. He was looking at his hands. I told myself I could not be certain. That an old man with a startled horse— "You are certain," I said. A silence. "I have not slept well since June," he said carefully. I thanked him and left. On the boardwalk, I stood for a moment in the morning heat and thought about Aldous Fitch eating dinner with the mayor the week after 11 men died, about the way power protected itself, about how it had beaten me once already. Then I thought about Edmund's last letter and the different hand that had written the closing lines. I was not going to let it beat me again. I returned to Nora's eating house to find a man already there, sitting across from a pale and unhappy Nora, drinking coffee he had not paid for. He was exactly what he looked like. Money that had had time to polish itself. Silver-haired, well-tailored, with the particular brand of courtesy that contains a threat inside it, like a knife inside a handshake. His name was Doyle Hargrove. He ran the bank. He ran, as I would come to understand most things in Redstone Flats. He knew who I was. He set his offer on the table, train fare home plus $50. All I had to do was sign a document acknowledging I had no claim to anything associated with Edmund Graff's estate. I asked to read the document. I read it twice. It was thorough. It would eliminate not just property claims, but any right to contest the probate proceedings, request examination of financial records, or bring legal action related to Edmund's estate or his death. It was not the document of a man with a clear conscience. "I will need some time to consider," I said pleasantly. "Of course," he said, equally pleasantly. "I will need an answer by Friday." After he left, Nora exhaled like she'd been holding it since he sat down. I thought about Aldous Fitch, about how power worked, about the particular shape of a trap that was designed to look like generosity. "I am not signing anything," I told Nora. She nodded like she had expected nothing else. "Then we had better figure out what we are doing instead," she said, "and quickly, because that man does not strike me as someone who accepts no with any grace at all." She was right about that. She was right about most things, Nora. It was one of her most useful qualities. There are two kinds of men who smile at a woman in trouble. The kind who want to help her, and the kind who are the reason she is in trouble to begin with. Within 48 hours of arriving in Redstone Flats, I had met both. I went to find the attorney whose name Doc Hennessy had given me. The office was closed. A handwritten note said the attorney had relocated to Tucson. The ink looked recent, not quite dry. I was standing on the boardwalk processing this when a horse came around the corner of the adjacent building too fast. The rider hauled hard left to avoid running me down and controlled the animal with a minimum of visible effort. Then he looked down at me. It was the man from the livery. Up close, dark eyes, jaw set with the patience of someone who had learned that most situations did not actually require commentary. There was a long scar along his left forearm, old and silver, from some piece of machinery or misfortune years back. "You ought not stand in the gap between buildings," he said. "Horses come through there." "I was not aware it was a traffic corridor," I said. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a reaction, adjacent to one. He dismounted. His name was Cormac Brennan. He owned the Brennan Ranch north of town. He had known Edmund Graff. "The attorney's office," I said, nodding at the closed door. "How recently did he relocate?" "Week and a half ago," Cormac said, "right around the time Hargrove filed to take over probate administration." We looked at each other. Two people who had arrived at the same conclusion from different directions. "What was in that building before it was an attorney's office?" I asked. "Edmund's land office," he said, 20 years ago. He did not say anything else. He remounted and rode on. I watched him go and thought, this man knows more than he is saying, and he is choosing not to say it yet. And that choice is itself a kind of information. That evening, Nora had gathered intelligence through the cheerful, relentless operation of running the only decent eating house in a small town. A former clerk at Hargrove's bank, a young man named Perry Walsh, who had left the bank's employ 2 months ago under what he described as a matter of conscience, had come in for supper and talked. The mail-order advertisement for Edmund Graff had been placed and paid for by Hargrove's office. Edmund's name was used. Edmund's post office box received the responses. But Edmund had not placed the advertisement, had not selected respondents, and did not know about it until it had been running for some time. "He was the bait," Nora said quietly. I sat very still. "Hargrove needed someone to come in from outside," I said slowly. "Someone with no local ties, no existing relationships, no reason to ask questions about anything except her own future. A mail-order bride would arrive, sign whatever papers were put in front of her, and leave when it did not work out. Or stay, legally attached to the estate, and Hargrove controls the estate." "Except Edmund died before you got here," Nora said. "Or Edmund died because the game changed," I said. Nora looked at me steadily. "You are going to stay, are you not?" It was not a question. "I am going to stay," I said. At midnight, something woke me. A sound. Paper sliding under the storeroom door. An envelope. unmarked. Inside, a hand-drawn copy of Edmund Graff's land survey, showing property lines and a dotted line representing the projected railroad route. Edmund's land cut directly across that route. Half a mile of the most valuable corridor in the territory. No signature, no note. One word on the front of the envelope, Rose, written in precise, angular handwriting. Economical. Cormac Brennan was the only person in Redstone Flats who had spoken to me that day, and whose handwriting I had not yet seen, but whose character suggested exactly this kind of action. Information delivered without obligation, help given without the requirement of gratitude. I spread the map on the floor in the lamplight and looked at it for a long time. Edmund Graff had been an old man who knew he was in danger. He had sent for a woman from Cincinnati based on 14 letters. He had, I was beginning to believe, been considerably more deliberate than anyone in this town was accounting for. I was beginning to think I had not come to Redstone Flats by accident. I was beginning to think Edmund had sent for exactly the right woman. I'd been in Redstone Flats for 6 days when I realized I'd stopped thinking about leaving. Doc Hennessy needed help. His previous assistant had left in the spring and he had been managing alone, badly. I offered my services in exchange for the small room behind his office. 3 years of seamstress work had given me steadier hands and finer suturing than his arthritic ones could manage. I set 2 broken fingers, assisted with a tooth extraction, and redressed a burn wound on a ranch hand in my first 3 days. The ranch hand was from the Brennan spread. "You work for Cormac Brennan," I said, winding clean bandage around his forearm. "Yes, ma'am. 12 years. Is he a fair employer?" The man considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Fairest man I ever worked for. Does not say much. Does what he says he will do. Never asked a man to do something he would not do himself." I filed this. 3 days after the envelope, Cormac arrived at the doc's office with another of his hands who had taken a fence post to the ribs. Cracked, not broken. I strapped it while Cormac stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, taking up more space than strictly necessary. When his man left with instructions, Cormac did not go with him. We talked for the first time without an immediate crisis between us. Or rather, I talked, and he responded, which in his case constituted talking. "Did you put that map under my door?" I asked. "You're asking the wrong question," he said. "What is the right question?" "Ask what Edmund told me before he died." Edmund had called on Cormac 3 weeks before his death. Came to the Brennan Ranch himself, which he had not done in years. He told Cormac he believed Hargrove intended to take his land one way or another. He had made arrangements. He needed Cormac to make sure any woman who came in from the east got a fair chance to understand what she was walking into. "He trusted you," I said. "He trusted me to do the right thing," Cormac said. "Those are not always the same." He was telling me the true thing, but not the whole truth. There was history between him and Edmund that he was not offering and I was not yet positioned to ask for. I did not push. I had learned that certain things cannot be rushed. Hargrove sent a man on Friday morning to collect my answer about the document. I sent the man back with a letter. Written in my clearest hand, it stated that I was consulting with legal representation and required an additional 2 weeks. It cited 3 territorial statutes about the rights of named parties in contested estate proceedings. I had gotten the citations from a legal almanac in the doc's office. 14 months of trying to sue a coal company teaches you things. The man read my letter, looked at me with a new expression, left. Nora, watching from the doorway, slow clapped. "Where did you learn to cite territorial statute?" she asked. "I spent 14 months trying to sue a coal company," I said. "You learn things." That evening I spread Edmund's land map on my table. The railroad route, still not officially announced but an open secret among anyone paying attention, ran directly through Edmund's most valuable 50 acres. I was, according to some will that nobody had yet shown me, about to own that land, if I could survive long enough to claim it. I wrote a letter to a lawyer in Santa Fe that Hennessy had recommended, careful, factual, citing specific statutes, and paid a rider Nora trusted to carry it south that night. Then I sat by the window and looked at the red cliffs turning black against a sky full of stars, and thought about what Edmund Graff had set in motion before he died. He had been a man who knew he was losing a fight and instead of surrendering had changed the game. I knew what that felt like. I thought for the first time that I might actually be the right woman for this. Cormac Brennan was the most honest man I had ever met, which made it all the more striking when I realized there was something he had been carefully and methodically choosing not to tell me. I had been in Redstone Flats for 2 weeks. I had learned enough to know that 3 small ranchers had lost land to Hargrove's bank under suspicious circumstances over the past 4 years. That Perry Walsh had left the bank after being asked to backdate land transfer documents. That the Santa Fe lawyer whose name Hennessy had given me was real, licensed, and apparently untouched by Hargrove's reach. I had written to him. I was waiting for a reply. Cormac came to me deliberately. No injured ranch hand as pretext. He arrived at the doc's office in the late afternoon and asked if I had time to walk. We walked to the edge of town where the red cliffs began and the sound of Redstone Flats faded behind us. The light was going golden. The air had lost its midday violence. He talked. Her name was Margaret Everly. She was the daughter of a sheep rancher 2 valleys over. Cormac had met her when he was 26. He loved her with the kind of certainty that young men confuse for permanence. He proposed. Her father refused. Cormac had land, but not enough of it, not the right kind of money. Margaret said nothing to contradict her father. Cormac left. He went north to Montana, worked another man's cattle for 3 years, came back with enough money to buy the Brennan spread outright. When he came back, Margaret had married Edmund Graff. Edmund was 48 to her 25. He had land and stability and a quiet, steady decency that her father approved of. She was happy, Cormac said. The words cost him something. That was the part I could not quite... I had told myself she had made a mistake, that the money was the only reason, that she had not really chosen him. And then I came back and saw her, and she was genuinely happy. With him. That made it worse, I said. It made it the truth, he said. Which was worse, yes. Margaret had died of fever 2 years ago. Edmund was inconsolable for months. And Cormac, who had spent 6 years maintaining a careful distance from both of them, found himself sitting with Edmund in that empty ranch house. 2 old griefs sharing a kitchen table. They became friends, genuine friends. Perhaps the only people in the territory who understood what the other had lost. And Hargrove knows this, I said. Hargrove knows everything that happens in this valley. He is suggesting that a man with a complicated history regarding the deceased might have had reasons to want Edmund gone. He is building a frame, I said, in case he needs it. So if you help me openly, he uses your history with Margaret against you. He tries. But you helped me anyway, the map, Edmund's message. Edmund asked me to. A pause. And I had my own reasons. He did not elaborate. I did not ask, not yet. I need to show you something, Cormac said. He took me to the derelict land office, the building that used to be the attorney's office. He had a key. Inside, in a locked drawer opened with a second key Edmund had apparently given him years ago, was a letter. Edmund's handwriting, dated 8 weeks before his death, addressed to Cormac. I believe I will not be alive when you read this. I am leaving instructions with the probate office in Santa Fe. The real one, not Hargrove's people. There is a woman coming from Cincinnati. Her name is Calloway. Do not let them frighten her off. I picked her specifically. You will understand when you meet her. She reminded me in her letters of the way Margaret used to argue with her father, like she already knew she was right and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Take care of her, Mac. Or better yet, let her take care of herself. I suspect she will prefer it. I read the letter twice, handed it back. I stood in that dusty, abandoned office with the last light coming through the dirty window and thought about Edmund Graff, who had been dying and afraid, and had still spent his last weeks thinking about a woman he had never met, making arrangements, trusting that she would be enough. Then I thought about Cormac, who was standing 3 feet away with Edmund's letter in his hands, and who had been carrying that letter and that weight for 8 weeks without telling me. Not because he was hiding it, but because he had not yet decided I needed to know. He had been protecting me from the weight of it, until he was sure I could carry it. I found to my surprise that I was not angry about this at all. On the walk back, the sky did what New Mexico skies do without warning. It turned black in 20 minutes and opened. Not polite eastern rain, a full territorial cloudburst that turned the street into a river in 10 minutes. We took shelter in the doorway of the derelict office, pressed together by the narrowness of the space and the direction of the rain. Close enough that I could hear him breathing over the sound of the downpour. We did not speak for a long time. There is a particular kind of intimacy in surviving weather with someone. It requires nothing. It offers everything. Edmund was right about one thing, Cormac said finally. What is that? You already know you are right. You are just waiting for everyone else to catch up. I turned my head slightly. He was looking at the rain. Is that a compliment? I asked. It is an observation, he said. Whether it is a compliment depends on who you are talking to. I decided, standing in that doorway in the rain, that I was going to be very careful about Cormac Brennan, not because he was dangerous, though I suspected he could be, but because he was the kind of man who made careful seem unnecessary. And I had learned, at some cost, that unnecessary is not the same as wrong. Doyle Hargrove had been patient with me for exactly 3 weeks. Then he stopped being patient, and I learned what he actually was underneath all that silver hair and good tailoring. A man who had gotten everything he wanted for so long that he had forgotten other people were allowed to say no. My room at the doc's office was searched while I was working. Professionally done, almost nothing out of place. But I had left specific items in specific positions, a habit from the days of the lawsuit when I never trusted that my notes were safe. 3 things had been moved. The land map copy was gone. I had 3 other copies, one with Nora, one with Cormac, one in my boot. But the search told me something important. Hargrove no longer believed I would sign and leave quietly. He was escalating. He came himself this time. Arrived at the doc's office just before noon when Hennessy was out making his rounds, and I was alone. He set 2 things on the desk. First, a photograph. Cormac Brennan standing near the fence line of Edmund's eastern pasture. A date written on the back in ink. The night Edmund died. Second, a written statement from a hired hand claiming to have seen Cormac's horse on the eastern trail that evening. I have no interest in destroying Brennan, Hargrove said. His voice was comfortable, as if we were discussing the weather. He is a fixture here. People respect him. It would be unfortunate for everyone if this came to light. So do not let it come to light, I said. That is entirely in your hands, Miss Calloway. Sign the estate documents. Take the train home. And this, he tapped the photograph, stays in my desk drawer forever. I looked at the photograph, then at Hargrove, then I asked for until Monday. He gave me until Sunday. He was confident, leaving. He thought he had me. He thought a woman with $6.40 and no legal standing would weigh the options and choose the path that did not involve other people getting hurt on her behalf. He did not know me at all. I found Cormac at the Brennan Ranch and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which I had come to recognize as how he processed bad news. When I finished, the photograph is fabricated. I was in my own barn that night. 3 of my men can confirm it. But in this town, with this sheriff, fabricated evidence and real evidence carry the same weight. Then we go around this town, I said. The lawyer from Santa Fe, I received a reply. He is coming. He arrives Thursday. Hargrove will know the moment he steps off the stage. Then we need to move before that. We spent 2 hours at Cormac's kitchen table building a plan. Perry Walsh would testify about the backdated documents. Hennessy would provide a written account of his examination findings. Cormac would produce his alibi witnesses. I would request formal probate review from the territorial court, which bypassed Hargrove's control entirely. It was not enough. We both knew it, but it was something to move toward, and moving toward something is better than standing still, waiting to be swept away. I walked back to town alone. Cormac offered to ride with me, and I refused, too conscious of how it would look, how much ammunition it would give Hargrove's narrative. This was, I would later admit, a mistake. Halfway back, at the narrowing where the trail passed between two rock formations, a man stepped into my path. Not Hargrove's polished security. This one was rougher. Hired for a different kind of work, he did not say much. He did not need to. The message was in the blocking of the path and the hand near his gun. I had a scalpel in my skirt pocket. It belonged to Doc Hennessy, and I had taken to carrying it since the room was searched. I did not reach for it yet. I talked instead. I am very good at talking when I need to be. Calm, unhurried, asking questions that require answers, keeping his attention on my voice while I measured the distance to the rock formation on my left and the footing and the angle. When he moved toward me, I went left and up. The rock formation gave me height, which gave me a moment, which was enough to get the scalpel in my hand and make clear I knew how to use it. He stopped, reassessed, left. I walked the rest of the way to town with my hands shaking and my spine straight, and did not allow myself to shake visibly until I was inside Nora's eating house with the door closed. Cormac found out within an hour. Small towns, always. He arrived in the kind of controlled fury that is more alarming than the ordinary kind. He did not yell. He sat across from me and looked at my hand, the one that had held the scalpel, which had a shallow cut across the palm from where the blade moved when I tensed, and wrapped it in clean cloth he found in Nora's kitchen with focused, meticulous care. His hands were shaking slightly. I did not mention it. "I should have walked you back," he said. "I told you not to. You were right, and I should have done it anyway." He tied off the bandage, did not release my hand immediately. "You could have been—" "I was not." He looked up. His eyes were dark and very direct. "I know," he said. "I keep thinking about the version where you were." There was something in the way he said it that I filed away and took out later, alone in my room, and looked at for a long time. Not what he said, how he said it. Like the thought of a world where I had been hurt was a personal thing, not the concern of a man protecting someone in his care, but the fear of someone who had begun to believe against his better judgment that I was someone specific to him. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I was not reading too much into it. The lawyer from Santa Fe was a small, precise man named Gerald Aldous, who wore spectacles on a chain and treated legal documents with the reverence some men reserve for scripture. Getting him into town without Hargrove's knowledge required a method Nora devised involving a missing mule and 3 false reports that occupied Hargrove's man at the stage depot while we brought Aldous in through the back alley. He was visibly uncomfortable with the theatrical secrecy. He became considerably less comfortable and considerably more engaged when I put Edmund Graff's original correspondence in front of him. Then he reached into his case and removed a document. Edmund Graff had filed a will with the Santa Fe Territorial Probate Office 6 weeks before his death, bypassing Hargrove's bank entirely. The will was witnessed, notarized, unambiguously legal. It left the entirety of Edmund Graff's estate, the ranch, the land, the water rights, the livestock, and all financial holdings, to the woman named Rosaline Calloway of Cincinnati, Ohio, who will come to Redstone Flats in response to my invitation, and who I believe will know what to do with it. I read the will 3 times. Then I set it down. "He knew," I said. "He knew he was going to die." The will was filed 5 weeks before his death, Aldous confirmed. He came to our offices himself. He was quite clear about what he wanted and why. He paused. He said, and I'm quoting from my notes, "I am leaving it to a woman I have not yet met because the people I know in that valley are either already Hargroves or already afraid of him. I need someone who does not know yet that she ought to be afraid." Edmund Graff had never wanted a wife. He had wanted a weapon. He had chosen me, a woman he had never seen, based on 14 letters and the way I argued about the rights of working people, to be the thing that Doyle Hargrove had not planned for. I found I was not sorry about this at all. I found I was, in fact, furious enough to do exactly what he had hoped. Word reached Hargrove within hours. By evening, his men were positioned at the exits from Redstone Flats. The lawyer could not leave with the will. Cormac organized the neighboring ranchers, 4 of them, men who had watched their own land shrink over the years under Hargrove's pressure. They were not fighters, but they were armed and tired, and having a lawyer trapped in town was apparently the thing that finally made the arithmetic change. In the middle of this, Hargrove's man delivered a document to me, a letter, Cormac's signature at the bottom, dated 2 weeks before Edmund's death. It offered to purchase Edmund's eastern acres at significantly below market value, implying that Edmund's mental capacity might be diminishing. It was designed to suggest that Cormac had been maneuvering against Edmund long before his death. I looked at it, looked at Cormac, who had just come in from posting his ranch hands at the South Road. He read my face. Then he read the letter. "That is not—" "I know," I said. "Rose, I know it is not real." I did know. The letter forms were wrong. The language was wrong. Too formal. None of the economy I had come to associate with the way Cormac used words. I know. But I gave myself 30 seconds of allowing it to feel possible. Because it almost was. Because I had been fooled by paper before. Because I had learned not to trust certainty. Cormac watched me think. He did not defend himself. He did not explain. When the 30 seconds were up, I handed the letter back. "The signature is wrong," I said. "The letter M in the name does not match the one on your name in the county sale deed for the Anderson parcel. I looked at it last week." Cormac was quiet for a moment. "You memorized my signature from a county deed." "I memorize things that might be useful," I said. "It is a habit." Something in his face changed, not softened, reorganized. Like a door opening in a wall that did not appear to have any doors. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. Just that, nothing more. With the particular care of a man who had wanted to do something for a long time, and had finally decided that waiting was costing more than the risk. Then the door opened and Nora came in with a report about the South Road, and we went back to work. But I kept that moment. I put it somewhere safe and intended to return to it when this was over. I had been prepared for Cecily Hargrove to be many things. An obstacle, a complication. A woman so thoroughly in her husband's pocket that she had forgotten the shape of her own thinking. I had not been prepared for her to knock on my door at 2 in the morning and hand me the key to her husband's safe. She was composed in the way that people are composed when composure is armor rather than feeling. 32 years old, dark-haired, with eyes that had seen a great deal and had decided to appear to see nothing. She sat across from me at Nora's small kitchen table in the lamplight and told me the truth in a flat, steady voice. The way someone tells a story they have rehearsed many times alone. She had been married to Doyle for 12 years. She understood what the marriage was within the first year. She also understood that her husband was not merely unkind. He was criminal, and that he was careful and connected enough that the ordinary routes of escape were closed to her. So she began to plan. 3 years ago, she started making copies. Documents, letters, financial records. She kept them in a separate location and added to them methodically without hurry, because she had nowhere to go until she had enough. Before I could ask the obvious question, she answered it. She had written the final letters to me, posing as Edmund. He had dictated the early ones. Toward the end, when his hands shook too badly to write properly and he was running out of time, she had written for him. The last 2 letters were entirely hers. "I wrote you as Edmund because I needed someone to come," she said. "Someone without local connections. Someone who had enough anger and not enough to lose. The letters he dictated described you accurately. He was very specific about who he wanted." "He dictated them," I said, "until he could not anymore. The last 2 were mine. I told you that you were exactly the kind of woman this land needs. Steady, clear-eyed, not easily frightened." I was quiet for a moment. Outside, Redstone Flats made its ordinary night sounds. "What do you need from me?" I asked. She set a key on the table inside her husband's safe, the original of Edmund's fraudulent death certificate, the forged will naming Hargrove's bank as sole administrator, purchase documents for 3 parcels of land obtained through coercion, and financial records of 2 payments made to men whose work was, as Cecily put it, irregular. "The men who killed Edmund," I said. She did not answer, which was an answer. "Tomorrow night, Doyle is in Albuquerque," she said. "He attends a banker's dinner the 2nd Tuesday of every month. He takes both of his regular security men with him. The house is staffed only by the housekeeper who retires at 9. "Why now?" I asked. "Why not before?" "Because before I had documentation but no leverage. Your lawyer from Santa Fe gives us the other piece. The valid will establishes that the estate was defrauded, making this a criminal matter rather than a civil one. The case is now complete enough that it cannot be managed away." She stood and smoothed her skirt with a movement so habitual she probably did not know she did it. "I have been waiting 12 years for the right circumstance," she said. "You are the right circumstance, Miss Calloway." After she left, I sat alone for an hour. Then I went to find Cormac. He was at the edge of the Brennan property in the dark, sitting on a fence rail, looking at the sky. His version of thinking. I told him everything. He listened. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Do you trust her?" he said finally. "I trust that she has been more carefully patient than anyone else in this story, and that she is right about the evidence," I said. "Whether her motives are entirely clean, I do not need them to be clean. I need them pointed in the same direction as mine." He nodded slowly. "Edmund used to say the difference between a good plan and a great one was the number of people who wanted it to succeed for their own reasons." He got off the fence rail and stood beside me, both of us looking at the town below. The lights in the saloon, the dark shapes of buildings, the red cliffs above everything, black against a sky full of stars. "I need to say something," he said. "Then say it. I have been telling myself since you arrived that I was helping you because Edmund asked me to, because it was the right thing, because Hargrove is the kind of man who ought to be stopped." He paused. "Those things are all true. They are not the whole truth." I waited. "I am terrified of what happens tomorrow night," he said. "Not for me. That is new. I have not been afraid for someone else in a long time, and I am not managing it particularly well." I turned to look at him. He was looking at the stars, jaw set, the face of a man who has said the important thing and is now waiting to see what it costs him. "I know," I said quietly. "Rose, Mac." I put my hand on his arm. Just that. "We get through tomorrow, and then we talk about the rest of it properly. All right?" He looked down at my hand, then at my face. "All right," he said. We stood there a while longer without saying anything, while Redstone Flats made its ordinary night sounds below us. I thought about Edmund, who had trusted a stranger with his land and his legacy. About Cecily, who had waited 12 years for a door to open. About Cormac, who had spent years learning that leaving was easier than staying and was now, for the first time since I had known him, choosing to stay. I thought that tomorrow was going to be very dangerous. Then I stopped thinking about tomorrow and just stood there in the New Mexico dark next to the most honest man I had ever met and let the night be what it was. The plan had 17 steps. and we had accounted for most of the ways it could go wrong. What we had not accounted for was Doyle Hargrove coming home from Albuquerque a day early, because in 12 years of monthly dinners he had never once come home early, and Cecily was in the house when he arrived and could not get word out. Cormac and 2 trusted ranch hands entered the Hargrove house through the back, while I held position at the doc's office with Aldous and the documented evidence already gathered. The plan was clean. It was also, within 40 minutes, obsolete. Hargrove's carriage came up the drive before Cormac was out of the safe room. His security men fanned through the house. Cormac got out through a window, barely, with the safe's contents shoved inside his coat. One of his hands was not as fast. By morning, it was open. Hargrove had Cormac's man in custody on a charge of breaking and entering. His lawyers were producing injunctions. He stood in the middle of the main street and made a speech about lawlessness and outside agitators and a woman who had come to his town looking to steal a dead man's legacy. He was good at this. I had to acknowledge it. He had the voice and bearing of a man accustomed to being believed. And most of the people listening had spent years believing him because the alternative was expensive. And then something unexpected happened. Sheriff Walt Tanner walked out of his office, crossed the main street, and stood between Hargrove and the crowd. He reached into his vest pocket and produced a badge. Not the county sheriff's badge everyone knew. A different one. Federal. "Doyle Hargrove," Tanner said in the same unhurried voice he used for everything. "My name is Walter Tanner. I am a range detective with the United States Department of the Interior. I have been conducting an investigation in this territory for the past 18 months. I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, land theft, conspiracy to commit murder, and the murder of Edmund Graff." The street went very quiet. A horse somewhere stamped and blew. Nothing else moved. "The murder charge requires evidence," Hargrove said, in the tone of a man who was very good at staying composed. "It does," Tanner agreed. "I have the financial records of payments made to 2 men who are currently in federal custody in Santa Fe and have agreed to testify. I have the testimony of your former bank clerk regarding fraudulent documents. I have the written examination notes of the physician who examined Edmund Graff's body, which I recovered from your files 6 months ago." He glanced at me briefly. "I was waiting for the land will, the legitimate one, and a living witness to the coercion campaign. I now have both." Hargrove moved. His hand went for the gun at his hip, and I had not known he carried one, had not thought of him as a man who got his hands dirty personally. He was a man who used lawyers and hired security, and the long, patient pressure of money. He fired toward the doc's office window where Aldous was visible with the documents. The shot went through the glass. Doc Hennessy, who had been standing beside Aldous, took the bullet in his shoulder. I was moving before I decided to move. Inside the office and beside Hennessy before the second shot, which did not come because Cormac had come out of the crowd and had Hargrove's gun arm pinned against his back, and Tanner had his other arm, and it was over in seconds. But Hennessy was bleeding on the floor of his own office. I pressed my hands against the wound and the world narrowed to this. Stop the bleeding, right now. Nothing else. The bullet had passed through muscle cleanly. I knew this because I assessed it myself, hands steady, talking Hennessy through it in a calm voice, while around me Redstone Flats reorganized itself around the fact that its most powerful man was in handcuffs in the street. Through the broken window, I saw Cecily Hargrove walk out of the Hargrove house. She was carrying a leather satchel. She walked directly to Tanner and set it at his feet. "Everything that is not in the safe," she said. 12 years of documentation. I believe you will find it comprehensive." She looked at Doyle, handcuffed between Cormac and Tanner's deputy, who had apparently been positioned in town for weeks. She looked at her husband for a long moment. "You should have been kinder," she said. Then she looked away and did not look at him again. Cormac found me afterward, when Hennessy was stabilized and sleeping, and the office was quiet. He stood in the doorway. I was washing my hands at the basin. Neither of us spoke for a moment. "You said we would talk after," he said. "I did. This is after." I dried my hands and turned around and looked at Cormac Brennan, who had ridden into danger for a dead man's request, who had told me the truth when it would have been easier not to, who had been afraid for me and said so out loud, which I was beginning to understand was the most extraordinary thing about him. "Yes," I said. "This is after." The thing about after is that it turns out to be mostly paperwork. The law runs on documentation, which is perhaps why men like Doyle Hargrove are so good at manipulating it, and why women who know how to keep records are ultimately more dangerous to them than any gun. Hargrove was convicted on all counts 6 weeks later. 22 years in the federal penitentiary. The sentence was read aloud in the church hall, which was the largest building in Redstone Flats, and the only one that could hold everyone who wanted to be present. Cormac was beside me in the second row. His hand was over mine on the pew. Gerald Aldous walked me through the estate documents with the slightly reverent manner of a man who had rarely seen a case where the right person actually ended up with the right property. I owned Edmund's land. All of it. The ranch, the acreage, the railroad corridor, the water rights. I made 3 decisions immediately. The ranch house would become a proper medical clinic. Hennessy had been practicing in 2 rooms for 20 years. He deserved walls that did not leak. The railroad corridor land would be leased, not sold. The income would fund the clinic in perpetuity. The remaining parcels would be offered to the small ranchers Hargrove had displaced, at market value, paid over time with no bank with an agenda involved. Cormac, when I told him this, looked at me for a moment. "You know that is less money," he said. "I know," I said. "That is not what it is for." He nodded slowly. "Edmund would have approved. I know that too. I know." Nora expanded her eating house into the adjacent storefront and hired 2 women from the outlying farms who needed work. Perry Walsh was hired by Aldis's firm as a records clerk, which suited him precisely. Doc Hennessy recovered well, all things considered, and cried briefly when I showed him the clinic plans. He denied it afterward. Cecily Hargrove left Redstone Flats 3 weeks after the conviction. She took 1 small valise from the house, deliberately. She went to Denver, where a cousin was expecting her. She wrote me a letter from there, 4 sentences. The last one read, "I believe I may eventually learn what it feels like to make a decision that is entirely my own. I credit you with showing me it is possible." Tanner, whose real name was in fact Walter Tanner, was recalled to Washington but requested and received a posting back to New Mexico Territory. He said he had gotten used to the dust. I suspected he simply did not know how to live anywhere without something to investigate. The proposal was not dramatic. This is my favorite thing about it. An ordinary Sunday, 2 months after the conviction. Cormac rode over in the late afternoon and found me at the clinic site arguing with the building supervisor about the placement of the examination room windows. Cormac waited until I finished arguing, which took a while because I was thorough and the window placement mattered. Then he sent the man on an errand. He had a ring, plain silver with a small dark garnet. He had it made by the silversmith in the next town over and had gone back 3 times to be certain of the sizing. He did not get down on one knee. He simply held the ring out in his open palm, the way you offer something to a person you respect, not demanding, just presenting. "I am not easy to live with," he said. "I do not talk enough, and when I do, I am usually too direct. I work too much. I have 12 years of a habit of leaving when things get complicated, and I am working on it, but I want you to know the habit is there." "I know," I said. "I love you," he said. "I did not plan to. I want to do it for the rest of my life." I looked at the ring in his hand. I thought about Edmund, who trusted a stranger, about Cecily, who waited 12 years, about Thomas, who died because a powerful man decided his life was worth less than a repair bill. I picked up the ring. "I am not easy either," I said. "I argue with everyone. I keep records of things. I hold grudges against men who deserve them. I will fight with you about the window placement in our house, too. I am aware, he said. Yes, I said. That is my answer. He almost smiled. Then he did. The real one. The one that changed his whole face and made him look younger and less weighted down. You could have just said yes, he said. I did say yes. I said it thoroughly. We were married in the church on a Saturday in November, when the air had finally let go of the summer's heat and the red cliffs caught the morning light and held it like something precious. Nora was my attendant and cried before the ceremony even started. Hennessy stood with Cormac. I walked myself down the aisle as I had walked into every difficult thing in my life, without being escorted, without waiting for permission. The vows were our own words. Cormac's were short and precise. Mine were longer, because I am thorough, and because I had things to say that I had been storing up since a doorway in the rain, since a fence rail under a sky full of stars, since a man wrapped a cut on my hand with more care than the situation strictly required, and I understood for the first time that he was afraid of losing me. Afterward, half the town came to Nora's eating house, where there were very good biscuits and a fiddle player who knew more songs than anyone needed and played all of them. The clinic opened in the spring. The examination room windows were exactly where I said they should be. I was standing at the door on the first morning, early, the light still red and long across the flats, the air cool before the heat began, when the eastbound stage came through and stopped to change horses at the depot. A woman stepped off. Young, younger than I had been when I arrived. She was wearing her best dress, which had been slept in for 3 days, and she was carrying one bag, and she was standing on the platform of Redstone Flats, looking at a town she had never seen, with the specific expression of someone who has bet everything on a single hand and is waiting to see the cards turn. I knew that expression. I had worn it. I crossed the street. Good morning, I said. My name is Rose Brennan. Rose. You look like you could use some coffee and someone to tell you what this town is actually like. The woman looked at me. Some of the tension went out of her shoulders. I am supposed to be meeting someone, she said. A man named... I know most of them, I said. Come inside. Tell me everything. We will figure out the rest. I took her bag without being asked, the way Nora had once taken mine, without making it into anything more than a practical kindness, and walked her toward the eating house, where Nora was already putting the coffee on. Cormac was sitting on the front step of the clinic across the street, coffee in hand, watching. He raised the cup slightly. His particular economy of gesture, the language of a man who expresses everything in small movements. I raised 2 fingers in return. I see you. I am good. Go to work. He went to work. I came to Redstone Flats to be someone's wife. I became, in the end, something I had no category for when I arrived. A woman who stayed because she chose to, who built because she wanted to, who loved because she had met someone who made leaving feel like the greater loss. Edmund Graff chose me because I was not frightened enough. He was right. I was frightened. I am still frightened, some mornings, of one thing or another. But fear and forward are not opposites. I learned that somewhere between Cincinnati and the red cliffs of New Mexico territory, and I have not forgotten it. The woman on the platform this morning had the same look I had. That particular combination of terror and determination that means a person has run out of other options and decided to make something of the one that is left. I know what she needs. Not rescue, not pity, just someone who got here first and stayed long enough to know the way. I am that person now. I find I do not mind it at all. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.
The story of Rosaline Calloway is, at its heart, a quiet but powerful testament to resilience, justice, and the kind of courage that does not shout, but endures. Set against the harsh and unforgiving landscape of the American frontier, it reminds us that survival is not merely about strength of body, but clarity of mind and firmness of spirit. Rose begins her journey as a woman who has already lost nearly everything: her husband, her financial stability, and her faith in justice. Yet what makes her remarkable is not that she suffers, but that she refuses to be defined by that suffering. When the law fails her, when power shields the guilty, she does not collapse into bitterness. Instead, she learns, she adapts, and most importantly, she keeps moving forward. As she herself reflects, the difference between those who survive and those who do not is simply the direction they choose when everything falls apart. The story also offers a sharp moral lesson about power and corruption. Through figures like Doyle Hargrove and Aldous Fitch, we see how authority can be manipulated to serve greed and injustice. These men rely on fear, silence, and the assumption that ordinary people will not resist. But the narrative shows us something equally important. Power is not absolute. It can be challenged by truth, by persistence, and by people who refuse to look away. Rose's strength lies not in violence, but in intelligence and moral clarity. She gathers evidence, builds alliances, and uses knowledge as her weapon. In doing so, the story teaches us that justice is rarely immediate or easy, but it is possible when individuals are willing to stand firm, even when the odds are overwhelmingly against them. Another profound lesson comes through the relationships in the story. Nora, Cormac, Cecily, and even Edmund each represents a different kind of support or sacrifice. They remind us that while survival often begins as an individual act, it is sustained through community. Trust, when earned, becomes a powerful force. And sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is not to fight alone, but to allow others to stand beside them. Cormac Brennan, in particular, embodies quiet integrity. He does not seek recognition or control. He simply does what is right, even when it is complicated. Through him, the story suggests that true strength is often found in restraint, honesty, and the willingness to care deeply, even at personal risk. Perhaps the most meaningful transformation, however, is Rose's own. She arrives in Redstone Flats expecting to become someone's wife, dependent on circumstance. Instead, she becomes something far greater, a builder of justice, a protector of others, and a woman who chooses her own path. She does not just survive, she creates a life with purpose. She turns land into opportunity, wealth into fairness, and hardship into wisdom. In the end, the story leaves us with a simple but enduring truth. Fear is not the opposite of courage. It's not one can be afraid and still move forward. And often, the most important journeys begin not with certainty, but with a single decision to keep walking. That is the moral of this tale. When the world is unjust, when the path is unclear, and when everything seems lost, the only thing that truly matters is that you do not stop. Because sometimes, the act of continuing step by step is what changes everything.